Welcome to everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us here this afternoon to discuss using data to build and track effective programs. What an exciting topic. I was part of a session at the Best Friends Conference, for those of you who were there, where someone joked, we all got into animal welfare because we love data, right? Well, obviously you are the select few that do, and we are so glad that you are here joining us today. And even if you don't love data, we're hoping that we can change your mind on that and that you're going to be able to see how powerful data can be in the work you do every day to save the lives of animals. First things first, my name is Alexis Pugh, and I will be the moderator of today's presentation. And I'm going to do my best to shut up because we are joined by two of the smartest people I have ever met in my entire life. There is a reason why the letters P, H, and D are after their names. We have Dr. Michelle Donovan and Dr. Maureen Gillespie. You can see their titles right below them: Enterprise Analytics, Data Scientist. Woo! These people know what they are talking about. And today they are going to give you a ton of valuable information that we know is going to enable you to go right back to work to save more lives using data. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the presentation over. I will say one note of housekeeping. The chat is disabled during this presentation. However, the Q&A function is live. We did receive some questions in advance, which I will be presenting to the panelists at the end of their presentation. But feel free, as you hear things that are of great interest to you, to pop those questions into the Q&A, and we will make sure to get those answered, as many as we possibly can, given the time that we may have at the end. So I'm going to turn it over now, and I'm going to let these data rock stars tell you how you can be data rock stars as well.
Thank you so much, Alexis. That was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who's made time for this today. I know everybody's time is incredibly valuable, so I'm really excited to be able to add this to your set of knowledge. So today in this webinar, we'd like to make sure that by the end of this, you're going to be able to use data to better understand the landscape of everything that's happening around you, to use data to set life-saving goals, to implement programs that reach those goals, and to be able to measure your success. And then another little added benefit with being very data-driven is your ability to really problem solve with your colleagues. So we'll touch on that as well today. So one thing that I really want to mention to everybody and acknowledge is that a lot of times we talk about data and it sounds like it's in conflict with anything that isn't data. And that's just 100% not the case. We really are trying to bring together the things that you are so familiar with and that you are passionate about and that you care about and that you know about through your own lived experience, and bring it together with data, because that's where you're going to have the most powerful combination and in being able to make the most informed decisions possible. So when we think about the heart side of the equation, that's your expertise, that's your intuition that you've built because of the expertise that you have grown and earned over the years of working in your industry, in your organization. Sometimes this means anecdotes. Sometimes this is a single experience that you've seen. You heard somebody say that they were an exception to a rule somewhere along the way. But it also really helps us with the history and the context of what's happening. If we use data in isolation, sometimes it's something that's not insightful. It's something that we already knew about. Like that's not interesting, or that's not helpful to figure out how we solve this problem. But when we start with all of your really foundational knowledge and expertise, then that can really drive where we look at data and how we examine that data to figure out where to drill down deeper. So data can augment all of that knowledge and expertise that you have already. And the way that it does that is by being more exact. It's got that precision that you don't get from saying, I experienced this, right? You can say how many times it was experienced. You can say how much different it is than last year. Sometimes you're also able to determine a subtlety that you got a little bit of a hunch that, like, I feel like this is changing. I feel like something is different now. And you can say, you know what, that's only a 1% difference, but it's been a 1% difference every month for the last 36 months. That adds up after time, right? So those are those little subtleties that you might be able to catch sooner if you're really engaged with your data. And then the most exciting thing that data sometimes does is it reveals the unexpected. So when you've been doing something for a very long time and you've been doing it the same way, or you've been trying new things, you still have, because of your own experiences, you have certain ways that you're going to attack a problem. But what data helps you to do is to say, oh, that was actually counterintuitive, or that actually wasn't as big of a problem as I expected. I wonder what the difference is, and then you can dig down deeper. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. One of these things where you might think about anecdote or maybe limited data that we're using our own intuition to discover is some of these news articles that we saw a few years ago, the pandemic adoption boom, and then the pandemic puppy return. And you know, these were rooted in some amount of truth. There was some piece of data that led these journalists to come across these stories. There was some amount of, like, logically that makes sense, right? The shelters are empty. That must mean that there's so many more adoptions than have ever happened before. And then you start seeing the shelters filling up again. Well, we already bought into this idea that everybody was adopting, so that must be the reverse now. You can see logically where people would come up with that, but when you get to the data, you find new news stories that are coming along that really refute these concepts. These are myth busters. Did that adoption boom really happen? Are people really giving up on their pandemic puppies? No, we know that. We know through the data that that's not really happening. And so that's an insight. And one thing that I really can take away from this juxtaposition of, like, okay, this makes sense, but then this is really what's happening in the data, is that we have we have some biases, right? And we want to jump to certain conclusions and some things that we're used to, but just taking that minute, that step back and see, like, what does the data say? Even if I think I know exactly what it's going to say, it's worthwhile to check the data and see if you're really seeing it the way that you thought that it was going to be seen. So with that, I want to give you a little bit of a framework for how you can look at the data lifecycle and continuous improvement. And this is really where we start talking about tracking and building with data. So the first thing we want to do is baseline. And this is something that that in every industry and every organization I've ever seen, it really struggles a little bit, because you think, I know exactly what I want to do and I'm going to start working on it right away because I can save more lives if I implement this thing right away. But I would encourage to take a moment and capture as much baseline data as you can. And the reason for that is that we really want to be able to get to this tracking mechanism, but you can't see what change you've made if you haven't collected that data from the start. So that's a really important thing, is to know, what is that baseline data and where do I want to allocate my resources? And so if you let the data help you make that decision, you can use your knowledge and expertise and intuition to say, you know what, these are the 10 things that I really need to know about my shelter or my community or the rescues in my area. Or maybe there are some things that I need to know about, you know, we've seen in some of our analysis, we've seen things like weather patterns that have an impact, you know, like what are the things though that I'm going to focus on? You don't have to have every single thing ever, but let's think about the things that you do want to know at the beginning, so that you know where are my resources needed most. So then we move on to that next step after the baseline, and that's goal setting. So once you have that data, you can take a look at it and say, okay, I knew that we were struggling in this area or in that area, but now I see that this third area is also a contender for something that needs to be addressed. So what are my goals with each of these? Do I want to improve one? Do I want to improve another? How can I figure out where I want to attack the struggles that we might be having? So once you've identified what that goal is, then that's when you build, right? That's when you build the program. That's when you build the intervention. That's when you change a process and you really examine how that change is going to address the goal that you've set. And just as a little plug for more Best Friends resources that are out there, right? When we have an embed program, or when we do an assessment, this is exactly what we do. We collect all of the data, we figure out what goals need to be addressed, and then we help build programs that are going to address that are going to help us move the needle on those goals that we've set. So once you've built that program, it's important to track. And this is one of those early and often things to the extent possible. So sometimes some of the information that we've collected at Best Friends, it's it's a survey that goes out to thousands of people or thousands of shelters, and it's not really reasonable to track that weekly or even monthly. But for some other things, like your intakes, like your number of adoptions, like the number of transfers, like the number of animals that are coming to you that are heartworm positive, like those are the things that maybe you would want to track and make sure that you're keeping on top of on a regular basis, because that information is coming in regularly. You have the ability to track that. You're not reliant on, hundreds or thousands of community members to do that. And so those are the kinds of things that, to the extent possible, you want to track those as often as possible. That tracking is really, really essential for you to know, is my intervention, is my program, is it working? And if it is working, then great. You've now created a new normal for yourself. You've got a new baseline and you can set new goals. But if you're tracking and you're realizing, you know what, this is still not moving the needle that like the way that I wanted to, the data is going to help you figure out that it's not working much sooner than at some point when you're banging your head against the wall, like I'm doing everything that I thought that I was supposed to, what's going on here? You can intervene faster, you can pivot a little bit quicker. So I'm going to apply this kind of at a high level first and just talk about dogs. We've heard a lot about dogs. I think we're all familiar with dogs, so I'm not going to be giving you any information you haven't heard before, but it's just an example of how this process plays out. So the first thing we want to know is, what are we starting with? What is happening with dogs? And right here, we just have adoptions and intakes. Those are the two things that we've decided to baseline for this evaluation. So we look at this and you can see the dark orange line at the top, that's the number of dogs being admitted into shelters across the US over the years. And then that light orange line on the bottom, that's the number of dogs that are being adopted. So when you look at this, you can see, okay, pretty steady, but the two lines are closing in on each other over, from 2016 to 2019. We see a huge dip in both areas in, moving into 2020. And then we see a divergence of those lines. And that's where we see the struggle, right? It's not that either, we're seeing that dog adoptions are not decreasing, but they're not keeping pace with the number of dogs that are being admitted into shelters. And so once you can see that, you see that baseline, then you move into goal setting. And that goal setting, it's just not possible without your intuition, with your experience in your own shelter. You really have to take the environment. What is your community okay with? What ordinances do you have in place? What's your relationship with the city council? How many resources could we expend on this, right? So it's really important that you bring these two things together to set your goal. And then once you've set that, then you can decide on which program you're going to build, and then you track it to see if you're making progress or if you need to pivot. So that's a very broad example, but I'm going to switch it over to Maureen now, and she's going to give you some specific examples of how a couple of shelters have used the same process to save lives in their own communities.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so I'm going to now really focus in on these individual shelters and give some shelter stories about how these shelters have used their data, understand their baseline, set goals, build programs, and then track their successes. So we're going to start with Lehigh Valley Humane Society. You can move to the next slide. The new shelter director knew that the shelter had a public image problem that was tied to low save rates and adoption policies that had been in place for many years that prevented adoptable animals from leaving the shelter quickly enough to make room for new intakes. So they had a slight reprieve in 2020 during the pandemic, but then save rates dropped back to where they were before in 2021 and 2022. So here we see that intuition. They knew they had a public image problem. They thought that their adoption policies might be holding back animals from getting out of the shelter. And then the data was kind of bearing that out. Move to the next slide. So how could the shelter make a change? They really had to look at that baseline. So they wanted to know, was it cats or dogs that were most at risk? Where were those issues and what solutions could help? So this graph shows live outcomes, which are the darker colors, versus non-live outcomes, which are in light gray, for the monthly data in 2022 for this shelter. Dogs are shown in blue, cats are shown in gray. So the data really helps show a clear picture at that baseline. Cats are most at risk in this shelter, right? There's a lot of light gray for those cat bars, the ones that are in gray. And the shelter staff, again, getting that knowledge, that intuition from the shelter and that context from the shelter, they knew that they took in a ton of community cats as strays, and they were really scared in the shelter. So they weren't doing well behaviorally, which led them to be at risk right from the get-go. Right when they entered the shelter, they were at risk. And the shelter staff also knew that the dogs that looked friendly in their kennels fared better adoption-wise than those that were scared or defensive. So the shelter took this baseline data and their intuition and then started thinking about how do we set goals? How do we solve for this? All right, so we can move on to the next slide. So the goal really was to turn the shelter's life-saving trajectory around and become a trusted community organization. So some of the processes that this shelter did was to solve these, to work on these goals, was to introduce a 48-hour decompression period for cats, so their behavior could be better and more accurately assessed, right? A cat coming in from the community, even owner surrenders, right? After that 48 hours, they really needed some time to decompress to see what their behavior was really like. They also introduced a satellite foster program for their cats, and they were successful in implementing a TNVR program within their community. So with all of these changes to the cat intake process, the strain on the shelter with cats started to become alleviated. And then it allowed for more resources to be shifted to behavioral support for the dogs in the shelter. So those dogs got a little bit more behavioral support, so they were trained, right, to have better kennel presence, essentially. So these changes, along with an overhaul of the adoption process that made it more public friendly, less restrictive, all happened over the course of those 2021 and 2022 years, and the save rates began to increase. So we can move to the next slide. So take a look. This is the same sort of data that we just saw from 2022. This is the beginning of 2023, where they're able to start tracking their success. So again, we see the live outcomes in the darker colors, non-live outcomes in light gray. So using that data and the shelter-specific knowledge, there was huge improvements in cat and dog life-saving. So we're seeing those dark colors that are far larger than the non-live outcome, the light gray, for each of these months. And that progress was happening, and it was so visually clear within the data. We can move on to the next slide. And by comparing save rate from January through May of 2023 to that same time period, January to May in 2022, it was really clear that huge improvements had been made and that all of those interventions that they built were working. So imagine showing these success metrics, right? The cat save rate rose up to 85%. It's a 19-point increase from the same time the previous year. Dog save rate went up to 91%, which was 17 points higher than that same time period in 2022. So imagine showing these success metrics to your donors or to staff, the city government, and even your community, right? To show that those things that you did, the TNVR program, right? It's actually working and it's saving more lives. What better way to boost the community morale and get your shelter to become part of that trusted community? So this is an example of how data helped identify specific issues. The shelter staff and leadership used their expertise to problem solve along with best friends partners, and more animals were saved. All right, so we'll take a look at another shelter story. So just a slightly different way of looking at the data. Here we're going to actually compare a shelter against some similar shelters to see where one shelter might be doing something a little bit differently, and we can save some, they were able to save some more lives. So this is Ardmore Animal Shelter. This is a shelter that averages upwards of 4,000 animals per year in the South Central region of the United States. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So in 2021, this shelter had the highest intake of animals per capita of humans that Best Friend had seen in the entire national data set. This is in a relatively rural area in a region that has difficulty with dog life saving, And something seemed to be going on, right? It's why would there be so many animals per human in this community? And it was at magnitudes difference. So it was important to understand what may be happening there. So when we took a look, owner surrender rates were around 50% of intake of all of the intake of animals in that shelter. And what this shows us is that it's really high compared to the national average and other similar shelters within the area. So that was kind of a good indicator that something with owner surrenders might be going on. Move to the next slide. So using that data, Best Friends was able to reach out to that shelter, which has a government contract, and found out that while they were open admission and serving their community, the ones they had the government contract with, they were also taking in every owner surrender brought to them from many other counties that they had no contract with, and even across state lines. So this shelter was just overwhelmed, and their save rates were hovering a little bit lower than similar shelters in the area and the national average. And that was concerning, and they wanted to do something different. Okay, we can move to the next one. So the organization made a change. They focused on serving their community still, right? They're still open admission for their serviceable counties, the ones that they have government contract with. No animal gets turned away from the ones they have the government contract with. And it only takes animals from other counties when they're not near capacity, so that they have a chance to actually deploy their resources and expend resources on life-saving efforts for animals within the community that they serve. And these intake policies changed in 2022. And so by focusing on serving on their own community and the ones that they had government contracts with, save rates increased dramatically in 2022. So this shelter actually had the highest reduction in shelter deaths in the entire 2022 national data set. And it really showed how the community could still be served while maximizing life-saving efforts within the community. All right, we can move to the next one. So how can you do this? How can you use your data this way? So we just went through these stories of how you can baseline, you can start set goals, and then you can start building programs and tracking your success. So when you track your aggregated intake and outcome monthly data, you can get a clearer picture of how your organization is performing, and it helps you understand that baseline. It may help you find evidence that can confirm or refute intuitions about what's going on in your shelter, just as Michelle said, right? Like, is this really happening, or is there something else that I should be focusing my attention on? And when you enter species level monthly intakes by type, so things like stray, owner surrender, and outcomes by type, things like adoptions, return to owners, return to field, euthanasia, if you put this in Shelter Pet Data Alliance, which is one of these tools that we're going to be talking about in more detail in future webinars, you can then set goals and build programs based off your data. And Shelter Pet Data Alliance then lets you track progress using built-in graphics and visuals. Everything you saw here that I just presented, that comes from SPDA. And it saves you time because it gets your data into easily digestible forms for your stakeholders. So you don't have to build stuff in Excel or use a calculator. So Michelle is going to talk a little bit more about how you can make this transformation to data-driven processes in your organization and some challenges you might face along the way.
Thank you, Maureen. All right, so change management. This is something that, I know Best Friends Network Partners have a lot of information to share with you about, because that's oftentimes what we have to manage when we are making a transformation of some sort. And so I want to give you a few things that I've learned along the way that have really helped to make this data-driven transformation that might help you, and then some resources that we have to offer. So the first thing about change management is that, to make big change, you're going to have to disrupt. And we hear about that in technology all the time, but animal welfare is no different, right? When we've done something the same way for a while, people get used to it. And when we talk about changing it, some people can feel personally attacked. They can feel like maybe their job security is threatened. They might feel overwhelmed with the amount of work that they think they're going to need to do. And sometimes, especially in the data world, we feel very uncomfortable with the unknown. If we haven't been tracking data for a while, to suddenly say, oh, we're going to pull the data and figure out how things are, that makes people nervous. They don't know what the data is going to show. And so it's very natural to be concerned about what that might look like. So knowing that that is very natural. All of those reactions are expected, and that's not unusual to encounter that if you bring some ideas about how you're going to be using data to make decisions in your shelter or in your organization. So the first thing that I would say with this is to make sure to secure your leadership support. You might be the executive director, and so you are, as you know, you are leadership, but to the extent that there are other leaders in your organization, maybe you're reporting to a board, maybe you're reporting to a city council, maybe you're reporting to a mayor, maybe, maybe you have a team of leaders under you, and you want to make sure that you do get that support and that there is an understanding that this is an investment, it is a new way of doing business, and we think it's the right way to go. And so getting, feeling that out. And the reason I put that first on the list is because it's a bit of a prerequisite to really become a data-driven or a data-informed organization. If you don't have that leadership support, you're not going to get very far necessarily on your own, right? And so your first task, if they are not on board, is to help them to get on board before you move on to just implementing anything in the rest of the organization. So that's number one, is make sure that you are aligned with leadership on this. The next thing is to communicate transparently. We feel very strongly about transparency, and that goes for change management as well. So sometimes that means yes, there is going to be a little bit of extra work, or you're going to need to train to do something a little bit different. Sometimes it doesn't mean something that big though. And it's important to say, I don't think you're going to be responsible for this or that or the other thing. I think sometimes there's also a reluctance from a leader's perspective to tell the people around them, I don't know. I don't know how that's going to go, or I don't know how we're going to handle that situation. And what I don't want anybody to feel like they have to do is have all of the answers before you move forward with a change like this, because there's going to be some things that need to be addressed throughout. And it's okay to tell your team, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, or I don't have an answer for that yet. It's kind of dependent on how these other things go, or these other things. Hopefully you can also be transparent in your support for them and saying that, we are going to go through this together. If something turns up that was unexpected, that maybe reflects negatively on us, or that we struggle to achieve, we'll work together through it. Nobody's going to be held accountable for, individually for negative things. We're going to be working together to make these changes. The next thing is to really listen. And I know that's a part of communication, but I think it deserves its own bullet point, because if you're not listening to the concerns that your team has, or that your leadership has about what this will cost, you're not going to be able to respond adequately. You're not going to be able to be sympathetic or make sure that you're providing the kind of guidance that they individually need. And everybody has a different level of resiliency and a different level of excitement for adventure. There's probably going to be some people on your team that are like, oh, awesome, I love this, right? We hear about data all the time in the news. AI is everywhere. You don't have AI without good data. And so you really want to make sure that you're going to have people that are really excited about it, but maybe also listen to we're not doing AI right now, right? That's not on the table as of right now, but yes, the foundation, the building blocks of that. And some people might even see it as a career opportunity to really learn and dig deep. So you might want to listen for those kinds of things to see how you can really support your team, and your team can reciprocally support you. The next thing is that at some point you just have to do it. You just have to transform. You just have to jump in and say, I understand, when I've been in this situation before, what has worked best is to continue to communicate and share regularly, openly, all along the way. Even, it's better to over communicate than under communicate. People can, dismiss an email if they don't want to listen, if they don't want to read it. But if they want it and they don't have it, then that's a really big problem. Listen as much as you can. But when you start hearing the same things that you've already answered, you've already addressed, that's a time when okay, I've done my job. And this is just something that we're going to continue to be fearful of the unknown until it's no longer unknown, until we just make that switch over and do the thing, and then figure out, and understand, that's my next point, is understand that there will be missteps along the way. Anytime it's brand new, anytime there's a new thing that you are doing, there will be missteps along the way. There will be somebody who we forgot to communicate with, or there's going to be some, maybe some data point that we didn't think that we needed to collect, but oh, we really did need to collect it. And don't let those missteps, and make sure that your team also understands that those missteps don't mean that the whole thing was a failure. It means we need to adjust, we need to pivot, that there's something that we didn't expect, and that we can keep moving forward with it, despite the fact that maybe we didn't realize that it was going to cost this much money, or we didn't realize that it was going to require some upskilling of our team. So those are just missteps. That doesn't mean that, you know, as soon as you're like, oh, you know what, we didn't anticipate this, we've got to shut the whole thing down. So those would be my recommendations for change management. So after all of that, you know, the potential struggles that you might face with either a data-driven transformation or any of the programs that you might decide to implement as a result of those data-driven transformations, we also have some resources to share with you to make this as easy as possible. The first one that Maureen mentioned is Shelter Pet Data Alliance. So it's been live for a few months now. We just released a really awesome new feature. Again, all of the visuals that Maureen shared with you are from Shelter Pet Data Alliance. So if you are logged in and you have your data uploaded, you can get access to all of those visualizations. And so I think somebody is going to be putting that link in the chat in case you are not part of Shelter Pet Data Alliance yet. The next thing is consult with a data scientist. So if you love to hear what Maureen had to say about those two specific shelters, she can do that with your shelter too. You know, sometimes I think just the first step, you open it up and you're like, okay, there's a lot of resources, but where do I start? Maureen is great at helping figure that out and helping to tell the story that she sees with your data and see how it aligns with your own experience. She's had a 100% success rate in being able to tell the shelter's story through data by just looking at the data. So it's really exciting. So you can use her as a bit of a fortune teller if you'd like. Or you could also use her to just help understand how you can continue to come back to Shelter Pet Data Alliance and see what's happening in there and what you can do, how you can use that to track your progress. Of course, Best Friends Network Partner has access to tons of educational materials related to data, related to programs, related to change management. There's just so many things. You know, it's a treasure trove. So if you have a specific topic that you'd like to have, you know, you'd like to know more information about, please seek out somebody from Network Partnership so that they can help you navigate all of the amazing resources that are available. And then, of course, we have 2 more webinars in this series, and I'm really excited about the very next one that's coming up in September, persuading people through the power of data. This is a really fun one for me. We're going to help you with audience evaluation, just really looking at what audience are you trying to persuade. We're going to talk about some fundamentals of how to tell that data story, right? Stories are powerful, and we all know that, right? And the animals make it so easy to tell good stories. And so how do we bring those things together to make it persuasive? And some tips and tricks for making any of your data visualizations or your data story easier to interpret. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. Alexis, what questions do we have?
Wow. I feel like I need to take a moment and digest everything that I just learned. Because I'll tell you one thing that I have learned in my years in this industry before joining Best Friends and working in shelters is that data has all the answers, but data can be scary. So I would love to, if I could, kick off the Q&A with a question from me for people who may be on this call, which is, you can look at a big set of data from your shelter software and you can export it into Excel and you can stare at the numbers. But when you're exhausted and you just got finished taking in a litter of 15 puppies in the clinic called because there's parvo and oh, those kittens need bottle fed, and you've got an angry person and your brain just isn't in a place, where do you start? Where do you start? What's the first thing, the basic thing someone can do to dive into the world of data and animal welfare?
Alexis, I love that question. And I will give a partial answer and then I'll hand it over to Maureen. But one thing that I think is really important is that you don't have to use tons of data. Like, you don't have to be big data to be a data person, to use data, right? You really can think about like, I do this in data sets when I'm analyzing data still. I will go through and I'll look at it and it's enormous and it's overwhelming. and I just start in the first column. Do I need that column? Great, I'm going to delete it just because it's overwhelming, right? And I will pare it down until it's a manageable size. And that is something that Shelter Pet Data Alliance helps with, because we only ask for a handful of data points. And so we've distilled it down to the things that we think are most useful. And then you don't have to go through all of the trouble of figuring out what is important or what's meaningful. Or, you know, a lot of times we have two data points that are very similar to each other. Which one do I use? Or, you know, so there's a lot of that kind of work that Shelter Pet Data Alliance has already done for you.
Yeah, and I think kind of going on that too, like often when I'm working with a shelter and I'm, you know, using something like Shelter Pet Data Alliance that has these visuals, we have the option to look at totals versus species, right? So you can look kind of what's happening on the whole, right? What's happening at the totality in the shelter, and then maybe start breaking it down when you feel like you have a good grasp on that. Like, is there something different happening with my cats and dogs? Then you can just go to species. And then, you know, kind of digging down a little bit deeper that way. And I think by doing that, that helps kind of minimize that, like, you know, just the wildness and the amount of data. And then kind of looking for trends. I like a squint test sometimes. And these visuals allow you to do that, where you can kind of almost like unfocus your eyes and look. Do you see downward trends? Do you see upward trends? Those are good things to look at to kind of get started in thinking about what's that next step? What am I going to dig in deeper to?
Amazing. What a great suggestion. I love the squint test. Everyone jot down squint test. I don't have to try though, 'cause
Yeah,
I don't
neither
have
do I.
very good
Just take off the
eyesight, so
glasses.
squinting is natural for me. Okay, so on that note, we just had a great question in the Q&A coming from Christy Schilling. We provide shelter intervention and surrender prevention and have trouble getting data as well as really any solid system for tracking. So can you talk a little bit about how you've seen effective data collection and management for those sort of pet resource prevention, owner surrender prevention programs that so many shelters are moving to today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that we struggle with a little bit, because in animal welfare in general, there's a lack of consistency across the board, right? And so we and others in the data space in animal welfare, it's a niche, but it's definitely, there's a group of us that work together to try and make it as consistent as possible so that you're not having to figure out a whole bunch of different things. And that is one area that we're a little bit behind on in getting everybody on the same page. Now, if you have a shelter management software, hopefully you've identified one that will collect that kind of information, but it is likely that you aren't necessarily getting the report outs from your shelter management software that's going to really help you to make decisions. But I think that's probably, you know, if you're a network partner, you've got access to Maureen, she can probably help you look at that data as well and help you come up with some insights and figure out, okay, is there something else that you need to access? You know, we also have plenty of other tracking tools that are on the market, right? So if you were interested in building kind of your own thing, like we've realized that this is important and that is important, and this is a marker of whether we're going to be successful or not, and this is something that the public is really interested in knowing about, you can build your own. I wouldn't recommend it in most cases because it is a lot of investment and time. So if you can find a tracker that's already out there, I would recommend that as well.
And I'll just chime in and say, not to give a plug to another product, but I was a user of Shelter Love, and they have a really great community services tracking portal that you can utilize even if you're not using them as your main shelter software, and you can utilize it for free. So I would recommend checking that out. That's how we tracked all of our requests for services, what services we provided, how much dog food. You can do it down to the weight of the bag. So so something to check out if you're looking for, yes, Shelter Love, Christy, and it's LUV, because you know in the industry we don't like to spell words the way the dictionary does. We like to make it cute. A forever home, right? We've all seen that, right? Okay, so speaking of other software platforms and Shelter Love, one of the questions that we received panelists prior to today was about the onboarding of various shelter softwares and their partnership and collaboration with SPDA. Specifically, I was asked about Shelter Love, but we know there's several predominant platforms out there. Can you talk a little bit about the rollout and when we think some of those automated uploads may be happening?
Absolutely. So we have already rolled out the PetPoint automated data collection. So if you are a PetPoint user and you have not yet shared your credentials with us so that we can get that information automatically, you should absolutely do that, because it's incredible. There's no work after you get that set up. It's really, really fantastic. And next is we do have plans with Shelter Buddy. We're hoping to get that rolled out in the next couple of months. So if you're a Shelter Buddy user, that's coming right up, and Chameleon as well. Shelter Love is we're definitely working with them. They're going through a little bit of a technological transformation themselves, and so it's not on their playbook right now, but we are also building a playbook so that any shelter management software can connect and get all of that data automatically. Now, that's not the only way Shelter Pet Data Alliance works, though, because we do have all of the manual entry that you can do monthly, annually, whatever you have to provide. That's going to help us to give you better insights for your own shelter, the more information that you provide. So yes, those cool automatic ones. You know, the first time we've been able to take animal level data and bring it into our platform so that we can do all of the manipulation that needs to happen so that we can spit out beautiful, clean reports for you. It is in progress, but in the meantime, any data that you provide, it's already available to any shelter.
Yeah, and we definitely encourage, the monthly data is kind of the gold standard here if we can, because that really makes those visuals really useful, and not just useful at the end of the year, but as you're going along. Many of you are on a different fiscal year, right? So you might need to look from July to June or something like that. So if you have that monthly data, that's going to be the most useful for you in those cases. So, but yearly's great, of course, but monthly really makes it the most useful.
Okay, another question that has come up in the Q&A here today, but we also received ahead of time, was if you could walk us through the similarities or differences, or how does this compare with Shelter Animals Count, which is a platform that I know a lot of people are used to, and of course this is a new platform. So can we talk a little bit about the special features of SPDA and why Best Friends has rolled out this exciting new technology?
Sure. So Shelter Animals Count is a great platform. They do a lot of great work, and we do a little bit different work than what they do. And so we did end up building this so that we could get the insights that would help us to allocate our resources and to make sure that we are that we're really helping as many shelters as possible through the lens of the type of work that Best Friends does, and to give that ability to do things like for those of you who saw all of the visuals that Maureen provided, they present in a different way, and there's benefits in variety and having multiple options and opportunities. And so that's really what this was all about, is making sure that we met a variety of needs.
And I'll just say, as a user of this platform, that it is so impactful for me. So my title at Best Friends is I'm the Director of Life-Saving Centers for the East Region. And so I get to oversee transport programming, shelter training programming, where we come on site and teach you different processes, help with foster programming, all of these sorts of things. And if we don't know what your need is, then we might give you the wrong thing. If you've solved for your cat problem and we're trying to help you with community cats, you may be like, that's not where I need your help right now. And so this tool is something that we're going to be using internally to make sure that we're deploying our resources as efficiently and effectively as we can to give you the exact help that you need to save more lives. We don't want to just throw everything out there and see what sticks. We want to give you targeted strategic solutions. And the only way we can do that is if we have targeted strategic data that points us in the right direction. So this is an exciting tool for us internally too, on the programming side. And again, thanks to the two smartest women on the planet along with the amazing team. There's a lot of people involved in this who made this all happen. So very exciting. And what's really cool is if you attend the next two webinars in this series, you're going to learn about even more programmatic offerings that SPDA has. There is something called One Alliance that blew my mind. So you're gonna have to tune into the next two to check that out. Again, the link is in the chat about how you can sign up to make sure you're registered for those sessions. But One Alliance, it's a game changer, y'all, and I hope you will tune in to check those out. Okay, so I've got a couple more questions here in the chat that I want to get to. Carrie, oh, Carrie is seeing a constant upward trend with exotic and pocket pets. Oh my goodness. But their live release rate is only based on cat and dog numbers. So in this SPDA platform, when we're documenting those save rates and those live release rates, is that going to include all categories of animals, all species? Does it just focus on dog and cat, or is that something that is going to be user selected? Would y'all care to comment on that?
Yeah, as of right now, we're focused on dogs and cats. That's really, you know, that's the majority of the animals that come in to most shelters. And so obviously, Carrie, you've got a unique situation on your hands, maybe not super unique. I've heard similar trends. And we do, however, have an opportunity for you to share undesignated species with us. So while it's not included in the visualizations right now, the data is available. And so we hope to offer that in the future to give a little bit more variety and ability to see that. We're really excited to share these big, revelatory visualizations right now, and we're going to continue to build indefinitely on the capabilities.
Yeah, and then here's one, Chris. Chris just popped in the Q&A, and I think that a lot of people can relate to this. And this is why we're talking about automation here today, Chris, because we want to make this as seamless and easy for you as possible. But Chris said, can you share more about this being a new tool? I'm a bit overwhelmed with so many platforms, all of the benefits, the features, and knowing what to go with. So a little more context for this new SPDA platform. Well, Chris, I hate to do the like to be continued, you know, like your favorite TV show. We're going to say stay tuned, but if you tune into the next two sessions of this, we're going to really get more granular and in the weeds about what those SPDA features are, so you can make that decision for yourself about whether this is the correct platform. But I can tell you again, these brilliant data scientists have really thought strategically about what this data set or what this platform needs to be effective for you. And we know the number one thing is it needs to be easy. It cannot make your lives more difficult and give you another thing on your to-do list. And so they're working really diligently to be able to move the needle from that manual report upload into that automation. So you don't even have to think twice about it. And then you get all the features and benefits out of the platform without adding more to your work day. Maureen, Michelle, anything else to add on that about, you know, features and benefits we can tease ahead here today?
I would say one thing is like this won't replace your shelter management software, but you don't necessarily need a shelter management software to use the SPDA tool. So that's kind of nice. So it won't replace it, but it does allow for this like quick and easy visuals that we now know can be embedded into websites. And you can have your data, if you're going really transparent, it can be right up there directly from this platform. So that's a really cool thing that it just automatically allows you to do. Yeah, in terms of the tool like One Alliance, I think that's a real revolutionary tool that's going to be out there, and we'll be telling more about that in October.
All right, so September, next session, you are going to learn about, I mean, listen to this sentence. Why wouldn't you attend? Persuading people through the power of data. Whew. That means fundraising. That means getting a budget for your organization. That means getting advocates to support the programs that you want to run. That means everything. And these amazing professionals are going to teach you how you can use data to persuade people to give you the kind of support you're looking for. I sat in a session at conference with an amazing shelter director, Misty Valenta, out of Williamson County Regional Shelter in Texas. And she was literally showing us the data visualizations and the graphics she was learning how to make in Excel. And when she was able to shift to utilizing these, having the people who make data, these amazing professionals, do it for her, not only did the quality turn out better, not only is it more convincing and persuasive, but guess what? it saved her time to do the things she's supposed to be doing as a shelter director, which is saving lives, not learning how to make pie charts in Excel. So I hope you'll join us, same time, same place, September 14th, Persuading People with the Power of Data. That is session 2 in this amazing series about life saving with data. Thank you for joining us. You will all receive a recording of this so you can go back and review it. Links in the chat, but go ahead and get started now. Shelterpetdata.org. That is shelterpetdata.org. Check it out. We hope you will join us on this journey to make data the priority for America's shelters so we can all save lives together. Thanks and have a great afternoon.